I think it's fair to say, and it was great to hear from Yanis and James, that this transition is going to require huge amounts of money and investments. Some estimates say as much as $90 trillion by 2030. And much of that money can't come from the public sector. It will have to come from investors in all of their shapes and sizes, including pension funds, asset managers, investment banks, traders, capital markets, and even retail banking, where you and I have bank accounts and where we might borrow money. So really sustainable finance, to me anyway, is both greening the financial services sector, so ensuring the whole of the finance sector globally rethinks the way it approaches governance and disclosure and standards and even accountancy to some extent, to make sure that we embed climate into our decision making day to day, no matter what we invest in, but also that we start channeling much more money than we have historically into sustainable infrastructure. And that goes from infrastructure whose purpose isn't necessarily to be sustainable. Things like hospitals and schools and our homes will need to be aligned with net zero, and we'll need to be financing that, both retrofitting existing infrastructure and building new infrastructure. Also large scale infrastructure like energy, but also quite small scale stuff as well, like retrofitting homes and heating, which is in general actually fairly small sums of money, but that need to be replicated millions of times, quite literally. So really for me, financing sustainable infrastructure and technology is thinking about climate risk is a really important element of that. So being better at understanding if an asset that we're building or we're investing in is at risk of climate and how we can reduce that risk, understanding what that risk look like. So depending on the country, it could be flood and storm, or it could be heat wave and drought, or both. Or it can be sea level rise, so making sure we understand these risks much better than we have so far. And that's going to take better collaboration, I think, with academia, universities, people who are involved in climate modeling, so that this knowledge transfers better into the finance sector. It's also taking ESG metrics and making those central to the decision-making process in investment. And when I say ESG, so environmental, social, and governance issues. And both James and Yanis have touched on them. On social elements, it's thinking about, are we creating more green jobs and are we avoiding people losing jobs, especially when we think about fossil fuel infrastructure? So rather than, for example, decommissioning an oil rig, can we transition it into a hydrogen plant instead and keep these jobs and repurpose them into different jobs? Also promoting better access to social services for everybody. On the environmental side, it's considering things like climate impacts. So carbon emissions is the easy one, and is the one that everybody is talking about. But we also increasingly need to start thinking about our impacts on biodiversity, on pollution, air pollution, water pollution, soil pollution, and on waste as well. Are we trying to avoid getting more waste into landfill and also continuing that pollution cycle? And then on governance, I think that's probably a theme that we've gotten much better at in the last few years, but increasingly making sure we're transparent and lawful, and that we disclose the activities that we do, and that we better disclose all of these climate metrics that I'm talking about. And this is the work that we're doing in Green Investment Group. So all of these ESG elements we embed in the way that we assess the investments that we make. And if they don't meet all of these objectives, or if they negatively impact these objectives, then we don't pursue that investment at all, and we'll just finish the deal without doing it, which I think is quite important. So I guess building on that and on what Yanis and James have said, where we've gone so far, or where we are at today, I think we're seeing really great progress from the financial sector in following what a lot of countries have been doing, especially last year and this year ahead of COP26, in making net zero commitments, which is brilliant. But I think at the moment it's very much the leaders of the pack are going ahead of these conversations, and we need all the laggards and the financial institutions who don't think about it to bring them into that conversation as well. And I think to some extent it's going to take more regulation, and not necessarily individual countries making up their own regulations, but trying as much as possible having a global or international standards for greening the financial sector and thinking about what net zero actually means. You know, if I compare it, for example, with accounting, we've had accountants for hundreds of years. And if we employed a Chinese accountant or an American accountant or a British accountant, we would probably end up with pretty much the same product. We have the same way around the world of thinking about balance sheets and cash flows. And ideally, we need to get to the same point on how we do net zero accounting. So how do we measure carbon emissions and nature impacts? Like I was talking about, we really need to get to that point. So I think at this stage, the financial services sector is looking at governments to help guide us a little bit in these decisions and on what standards and methodologies need to be used. And COP26 is a really helpful platform for having these conversations.